If it's Wednesday, Donald Trump gets some electoral revenge, taking down Congresswoman Liz Cheney in her Wyoming primary. One of the last remaining elected Republicans willing to publicly take on Trump. What does it mean for the future of the party and the country? Plus, new pressure on the former president in multiple legal cases. Rudy Giuliani testifies before that special grand jury in Georgia today. And a federal judge gets set to decide whether to unseal a document at the heart of the FBI's Mar-a-Lago search. And 1 week before the Florida primary, a state court is denying a parentless teenager access to an abortion. What the emotionally fraught story says about medicine and the law in post-Roe America. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd. The reshaping of the Republican Party and the purging of Donald Trump's rivals continued last night in Wyoming. Congresswoman Liz Cheney, the most outspoken Republican critic of the former president, was soundly defeated in her primary, losing the race by nearly 40 points. The latest sign that a portion of the Republican Party that does not pledge loyalty to Donald Trump and his election lies appears to be shrinking or simply being driven underground. The winner in Wyoming, Trump-backed candidate Harriet Hageman, who called the 2020 presidential election rigged without ever providing any evidence. Cheney only carried 2 counties statewide, the same 2 counties Joe Biden carried in the 2020 election in Wyoming. The result is not a surprise, nor is Cheney's reaction to the result. But it doesn't make it any less consequential of a development for the future of the Republican Party. During her remarks last night, Cheney looked beyond her race to express her concern over the forces that led to her defeat.
If we do not condemn the conspiracies and the lies, if we do not hold those responsible to account, we will be excusing this conduct, and it will become a feature of all elections. America will never be the same. Our survival is not guaranteed. History has shown us over and over again how poisonous lies destroy free nations.
Not long after the polls closed, Cheney converted her campaign account to a PAC named The Great Task and told my colleague Savannah Guthrie this morning that, yes, she is thinking about a run for president. Cheney may have a platform and the national attention right now, but losing this race does not make her stronger in a fight against Trump and Trumpism, at least inside the GOP. And she is no longer going to be fighting the fire from inside the House, literally and figuratively. This begs the question, who is going to pick up the anti-Trump mantle inside the elected Republican Party now? Who's left in the party, at least from its traditional power bases and networks, to take on Trump if he runs? The most decisive way to defeat Trumpism is if Republicans rally together to do it themselves and not hope that somehow the Democrats or the media or law enforcement agencies will do it for them. It's hard to believe that that person would come from the House. With Cheney's defeat, only 2 of 10 House Republicans who voted to impeach Trump after January 6th will even be on the ballot this November. Doesn't seem like it will be coming from an elected governor either. Like everywhere else in the party, the Trump skeptic bench is thin and getting thinner. Larry Hogan is term limited in Maryland, and his handpicked successor was defeated by a Trump-backed opponent. And as for the Senate, much of the governing wing of the party is already headed for the exits in the Trump era, and arguably the only person with power in Washington after November who could be a foil to Trump is the Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell. But while opposing Trump sometimes very vocally, and it may be in the interest, he believes, the long-term interest of the Republican Party, it isn't in McConnell's short-term interest. If McConnell hopes to once again lead a Republican majority in the Senate next year, which would happen only if a new crop of Trump loyalists who won Senate primaries that in many cases McConnell opposed, win their races this November. So do we think he's likely to stick his neck out on that front? Liz Cheney acknowledged last night she could have easily won her primary, but she'd have to compromise her principles, and that was something she was not willing to do. She is pledging that she will continue to fight against an ideology she says has set the nation headed towards crisis, lawlessness, and violence. But who's going to join her inside the elected wing of the Republican Party? Vaughn Hilliard's on the ground for us in Wyoming. Vaughn, I want to start with you. I had a chance to talk with somebody you've spent a little time with, and we're going to hear from him in a few minutes, Tom Rice, who also, in many ways, he didn't He didn't try to run an anti-Trump primary vocally. He actually tried to run a very traditional Republican primary. But the two of them basically lost by the same math.
I look forward to your conversation with Tom Rice, because I think it's also poignant that not only is Tom Rice in South Carolina, but you've got Peter Meyer up in Michigan. You've got Jamie Herrera Butler in the state of Washington. You've got Liz Cheney here in Wyoming. Essentially every corner of this map, voters, Republican voters, have rejected folks who have spoken out against Donald Trump here. But also, I think symbolically, not only Liz Cheney, George P. Bush, he ran against Trump-endorsed Ken Paxton for Attorney General in Texas. He also lost his primary. You know, if you look at where the Republican Party has gone over the last 14 years, it's radically different. And I think that that's where Liz Cheney, as part of her interview with Savannah earlier, she acknowledged, she wasn't even able to change the opinions of the folks in her own backyard about the smallest voting population there is in the country. And she couldn't convince her own folks in her own party to come on her side, despite 8 public hearings held by the January 6th Select Committee on national television with damning evidence against Donald Trump. She showed up with a 38 percentage point loss last night.
You know, Vaughn, it seems as if there are more Republican voters who sound like some of the Republican consultants that give advice to a Peter Meyer. He said, I was told, you don't have to believe the election was stolen, just say it. I talked to some voters who seem to say this to me, Vaughn. Hang on. Look, I don't know. Look, I'm sure Trump lost, but don't give the Democrats a talking point. And that seemed to hurt Liz Cheney, getting Democrats to help you. That was her real sin. This seems to be a weird place the GOP is headed.
Right, and I think that this has been the case the last 6-7 years now, Chuck, right, is that I think those folks, members of Congress who are in on it, right, know the truth, have led their voting population to actually believe the conspiracy theories, to actually legitimize them. You look at Iowa, right? I think it's a prime example. Joni Ernst and Chuck Grassley, if it were not for playing into the big lie and continuing to lift up Donald Trump, I think anybody in this country would agree that they were respected statesmen here, right? Joni Ernst is serving in the U.S. military. Chuck Grassley having represented his state for decades here. And yet when there is not that pushback, ultimately, this is what comes of it here. John Barrasso congratulating Harriet Hageman on her win here in Wyoming, right? It's not like Liz Cheney had the 2 U.S. senators coming out in her defense here. No member of Congress came out to campaign on her behalf here. Mike Pence didn't come out to campaign on her behalf here. She was a lone ranger. Tom Rice, when out in South Carolina, he was trying to fend for himself after serving for 10 years in the U.S. Congress. Paul Ryan, the former speaker, was the only Republican that came out to campaign and defend him. And so when you're a Republican voter here and you're hearing from the folks that you respect and trust that the election was actually stolen, what are you supposed to believe? And I think that that's why you see Liz Cheney losing by 38 percentage points.
Vaughn Hilliard on the ground for us in Wyoming on the fight for control of the Republican Party. Vaughn Hilliard, thank you. And joining me now is one of the impeachment 10 at South Carolina Republican Congressman Tom Rice. Congressman, it's good to see you. I appreciate you being here. But simple first question, your initial reaction to the primary defeat of your colleague, Liz Cheney.
Well, Chuck, thank you for having me. And I was certainly disappointed to see Liz's loss. She is a brave and honest and loyal patriot.
Is it pretty safe to say if the two of you did not vote to impeach, you both would be coming back next January?
Well, the seat doesn't belong to me and it doesn't belong to Liz. It belongs to the people. But I think our odds certainly went down when we voted to impeach.
What is the message, do you think, being sent now in these Republican primaries? I mean, of the 8, basically, only 2 have survived. One wasn't targeted by the former president who has survived the primary process. But in both cases, David Valdayo and Dan Newhouse, they're in a different type of primary system. Does that explain it, pure and simple?
Chuck, I think that the question's pretty settled about whether Donald Trump has influence on the Republican base. It's very apparent that a majority of the Republican base have loyalty to Donald Trump as a litmus test. And I think that's a shame. His performance in his candidates have performed very well in the primaries, but that doesn't necessarily play very well in the general election. And so we'll see how general election voters respond to this litmus test about denying that Trump lost the 2020 election. I mean, you know, in areas like Wyoming, which is very heavily Republican, and areas like my district in South Carolina, the Republican candidate's going to win. They're going to win the general election.
Right.
But on closer elections like Peter Meyer in Michigan and Jamie Herrera Butler in Washington State, I mean, those are two outstanding, thoughtful, brilliant, honest congressmen. And it's certainly a huge loss for the country that they lost in the primary. And it's going to be very difficult for the people who beat them to survive a general election challenge. So I think it hurts the Republican brand. And I think people in the Republican Party forget that, you know, yes, you need the base, but it takes more than the base to win an election. It takes moderates in the Republican Party. It takes independents and maybe even some moderate Democrats. And that's the way you win elections. You have to have a big tent and not just have this litmus test of loyalty to this very broken man.
What is your explanation of why you couldn't convince your constituents that going down this road with Trump was just not good for the country? You may feel loyal to him, but it really is not small c conservative.
Well, you know, I was loyal to him. I voted with him 94% of the time on the floor. I campaigned for him very heavily in 2020. I mean, I did as much as I know that I could do to make sure that Donald Trump was going to be the president. But when he lost, and through a 2-month temper tantrum following that, that culminated in the sacking of the United States Capitol and 4 or 5 people being killed and hundreds of Capitol police officers being beaten and injured, and he didn't lift a finger to stop it. When I saw all that happen, I couldn't support him anymore. It's clear to me that Trump was about Trump and not about the country, and I want a president who puts the country first. So I think it's a bad sign for the Republican Party. But in defense of the Republican Party, I have to say that, you know, the base is scared, and they saw what happened under Donald Trump when Republican policies were put into law, and the resulting flourishing of the United States economy and foreign policy wins that we had, and trade policy wins that we had, and you know, wages growing and unemployment at record lows across, and to see that in their eyes being swept away, they're fearful of that, and I think that's one reason why they don't trust the election process, because they can't believe that other people don't see it the same way. But unfortunately, they do.
Well, you're describing. I think you're describing blue America too. They don't quite get it either, right? We do have this miscommunication where there's just no way there's a majority for that, whatever that is, right, depending on where you're standing. But let me ask you this. I watched and
I got to say,
go ahead.
I got to say too that the last 3 presidents have not tried to bridge that gap. Yeah. I don't think Obama did it. I think it was more in your face. You know, remember when he said elections have consequences and you're going to take this. Yeah. And then Donald Trump certainly wasn't a bridge builder. And I think Joe Biden has made no effort to build bridges, rather than, you know, if he wanted to put together some kind of an economic package approaching Republicans and try to build bridges rather than holding out and seeing what he could get from Joe Manchin. I mean, we've got every president in my lifetime, up until Barack Obama, I believe, tried to build bridges to both parties. I think the American public has been, they're just sick of it. They're just sick of it.
Let me ask you this, though. It does feel as if that it is easier to rally folks to your side if you can make the case that the other side's mad. So, I mean, you know, own the libs is essentially. This is particularly a familiar pattern online, but you sort of see it where it's voters seem to be comfortable, maybe even voting against their own best interests, because it makes other people upset or mad. How do you get out of that dynamic?
You need a leader who wants to bring people together rather than tearing them apart. And I don't think Barack Obama was that. I certainly know that Donald Trump was not that, and I don't think Joe Biden's that. And I don't think Donald Trump, as a result, has any pathway to the presidency in the future. I think that's one of the reasons why he lost in 2020, that and COVID. He was just so divisive, and he just wore people out. And I don't think he has any pathway to the presidency in the future. He lost by 5 million popular vote in 2016. He lost by 7 million in 2020, and that was before January 6th. And now, after all that controversy, and even more of the moderates and independents being turned off by that, I think he would lose by a whole lot more. He'll lose in a landslide if he runs in 2024. He'll win the Republican nomination. That much is clear to me, particularly after these primary elections. But I think he'll lose in a landslide, and it'll hurt the Republican Party, and I think it'll hurt the country.
Do you fear? Let me ask you this.
Look, I think Donald Trump is Donald Trump's first concern.
Yeah, look, you took a strong stance that was clearly against the will of your party, as far as your party was concerned. Liz Cheney did. Are you concerned that no one else who's elected, who survives this, will take up this mantle next Congress? So for instance, we know how Mitch McConnell feels about Donald Trump. He's made it clear. But there's certain bridges he won't cross. And if you don't cross them, you're not going to. This virus lives inside the party, right? If you don't have the guts to confront Trump, you're never going to deal with this. Are you worried that there are going to be fewer people willing to publicly confront Trump because of what happened to you in your primary, or Liz Cheney and hers?
I hope not. I mean, I hope that there are people in both parties who are willing to confront their leadership and put their doing what's right for the country in front of keeping their job, or in front of fear of losing an election, or in front of towing the party line. I think we've got to have people who are willing to stand up to the party and say, no, you're going too far. Yeah. And certainly January 6th was too far for me. And, you saw it on the Democrat side as well, with Manchin and Sinema holding up this Build Back Better program until just recently. I wish they'd have held out a little bit longer, because I think what they pass is not going to be good for the country. But that being said, you had them on that side being willing to stand up and say, no, this is going too far.
But, it's interesting you bring that as an example. What they did do is shrink the package. Do you see anybody in the Republican Party who's able to actually moderate the party from Trumpism by doing that? It doesn't look like there's an whatever you think of the Democrats, they were willing to accommodate their moderates. Are you fearing the Republicans aren't willing to accommodate theirs?
I don't know how far they would have accommodated them come next election time. Kirsten Sinema and Manchin weren't facing a primary, but I don't know that the Democrats have a leader that's as vengeful and narcissistic as Donald Trump is, who's willing to go as far as he did to. I don't know of any president in history, and certainly
it's
not
close.
That would take up the mantle as far as going into individual congressional districts and campaigning against people who voted against him on an infrastructure package, or voted against him on impeachment, or voted against him on any other particular item. But his capacity for spite and vengefulness is beyond any I've ever seen.
Yeah, and it's certainly been weaponized with an electorate. Congressman Tom Rice, Republican from South Carolina, appreciate you coming on, sharing your perspective with us. Very helpful.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Honored to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. With me now, New York Times Chief White House Correspondent Peter Baker. He's also an NBC News political analyst. And Peter, Donald Trump went on a revenge tour sometime around the start of February in 2021. And the fruits of his labor, we now see. He's largely been successful at purging the elected Republican Party in more than I think some folks thought he would be. You confident that losses in November will somehow loosen his grip on the party?
I don't think anything is predictable at this point, Chuck. I think one thing we ought to be humble about is the fact that we have written off, or people have written off, Donald Trump before, saying, well, there's no way he could possibly survive this or recover from that. And he has demonstrated a continuing and sustained ability to exercise influence over the Republican base, and by extension, then the Republican Party and its elected office holders. So we'll see. Look, if for some reason the election this November turned out to be, a defeat for the Republicans when everything was on their side, there might be some rethinking and second guessing, right? Because, they should, by history standards, win the off-year election after a president's election. That's the normal standard thing. If for some reason they didn't take the House, that would be an earthquake within the Republican Party, and they would probably have to rethink things. That doesn't seem likely at the moment. That's not where people like you who are smart about politics think things are going to go. The Senate may be better for Democrats than the House. But I think right now we've seen, as of yesterday, that Donald Trump is the sole dominant figure in this party, and there's really no competition for that.
But is he so successfully warped sort of his messaging that, losing is the fault of the Republican elites? It's Mitch McConnell's fault. He's blaming Mitch McConnell for the Democrats passing their reconciliation bill. I mean, it is funny to me to watch Trump successfully prepare Mitch McConnell to be sort of the next Republican that MAGA feasts on. And Mitch McConnell has no interest in fighting him or stopping this from happening.
Well, and let's keep in mind that actually has shown Trump's limits, right? He has repeatedly, since leaving office, called on Senate Republicans to dump Mitch McConnell, to oust him as their leader. And Senate Republicans have reacted with a collective yawn. There hasn't been any move to do that because, in fact, Mitch McConnell does have the support of his caucus. And he does this through this, high wire act he plays, and he gets a lot of grief for it, and maybe rightly so. But he has successfully managed for these last 7 years, 5, 6, 7 years, to keep the MAGA part of the party happy enough with him, or at least not angry enough at him to change things within his own caucus, right? And at the same time, I think he reflects the concern and deeply felt, anxiety among a lot of establishment Republicans that they're not willing to say out loud about Donald Trump. And he manages to sort of somehow walk that wire. Whether he continued to or not, I don't know. But he has been remarkably successful at that.
He appears to be the only one left, right, that's going to be in the elected Republican ranks. And at best, he's a speed bump when it comes to Trumpism, because he's made it clear what he won't do.
That's right. No, I think, what matters most to Mitch McConnell is winning the Senate majority, right? And that's the thing he has made clear was his number one priority. He would like to be majority leader again. If, in fact, Trump gets in the way of that, he is willing to speak out. But he doesn't want to pick a fight for the sake of picking a fight. He doesn't believe in what Liz Cheney is doing in the sense of having this full-scale civil war. He made his point at the end of the impeachment trial in February of 2021, and he would like to move on and pretend that Donald Trump is not a factor, or at least won't be a factor at some point in the future. That's been an optimistic view on his part, because Donald Trump has continued to be the driving force, much to the chagrin, I think, of the McConnell wing of the party.
One other name I want to throw in here is the former Vice President Mike Pence. He surprised some people today when asked about the idea of potentially testifying before the January 6th committee, that he'd think about it, he'd be open to it. But it really got me thinking this, Peter, and that is, while Cheney may be the presidential candidate in 2024 who constantly is essentially on one issue, Mike Pence is setting himself up to basically be the Republicans rally around when they're done drinking from the MAGA table, right? When they're sort of ready to sober up. All right, well, we're not going to reward Liz Cheney, but we'll do Mike Pence. I've been a skeptic of that strategy. I feel like he's sort of owning it more and more, but it seems more viable than ever.
It is possibly. Look, his argument is, I was there for all of the things you cared about, the policies that mattered to you, the accomplishments that the Trump administration can claim, without the drama, without the legal issues, without the constitutional issues. I mean, his argument to them is, if you want Trumpism in the sense of the philosophy anyway, without the mishigas, if you will, then I'm your guy. Now, the trick for him, though, I'm still skeptical, Chuck, because I think that what people who like Trump in the party is his feistiness, is the fact that he's out there fighting, is the grievance politics that he taps into. And Mike Pence doesn't do that. He's not an angry avatar of modern Republican angst and grievance and resentment toward the establishment. It just is not his nature. And the question is whether or not the party is ready for somebody who is actually kind of sober-minded, quiet, studious, and may say the right things ideologically, but doesn't channel their emotion and their passion. Look,
it's a fascinating debate, and we're not going to resolve it here. Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Always a pleasure to get your perspective. Thank you, sir. Coming up, elections in the last frontier. why we only have some of the results from last night's primaries in Alaska, and why the information vacuum could be a cause for concern. Plus, the former president's grip on the GOP remains as strong as ever, but his legal problems do seem to be piling up. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. We're following developments in multiple investigations that are swirling around the former president. Today, his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, testified before a special grand jury in Georgia investigating efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Giuliani says he is a target of their investigation. That comes a day before former Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg is expected to plead guilty in a tax evasion case. Two people familiar with that case say they do not expect Weisselberg to cooperate in any further investigation against Donald Trump himself, but will likely cooperate in the case against the Trump Organization, just not Trump personally. We're also expecting to hear from a judge tomorrow whether the affidavit that provided the reasoning for last week's FBI search of Mar-a-Lago can be made public. The Justice Department says unsealing the affidavit could cause irreparable damage to an ongoing investigation, but Donald Trump and his allies have called for its release. Several news organizations, including NBC News, have separately requested access to this document. Blaine Alexander's in Fulton County, Georgia today. Also with me is David Priest, a former intelligence officer at the CIA who's now the publisher and COO of Lawfare. He's also author of The President's Book of Secrets, about the relationship between presidents and top secret intelligence. But Blaine, let me start with you. We've all seen the pictures of the media circus surrounding Rudy Giuliani and his planes, trains, and automobiles unknown question of how he got to Fulton County. But what have you learned today about the testimony? What can you tell us?
Well, Chuck, as for what happened inside, we know very little. Basically, what we know right now are kind of the bookends. We know how he got here. We know how he left. But as for the 6 or so hours in between, that is something that we don't know a lot about. You know, we know that he was inside the courtroom for the courthouse for more than 6 hours today. His entrance was very different from his departure. When he walked in, he used the most public entrance here at the courthouse. He literally walked up the courthouse steps, through the throng of reporters, through the many cameras that were awaiting him, walked into doors that, by the way, when he first walked up, were locked. A deputy had to open the door and let him inside. A very public entrance. 6 hours or so later, he left in a very different way. He left through the secure underground parking lot, the tinted windows, the SUV pulled right past reporters. So it's anybody's guess as to what happened inside. Now, we do know that his attorney gave some sort of insight saying that Giuliani was going to stay away from any discussion of conversations that he had with the former president, that he would invoke attorney-client privilege there. But as for how he answered those questions, specifically, as we expect, about his claims to lawmakers here in Georgia back in 2020, that's the big question, Chuck.
And Blaine, what do we expect next? Is there another high-profile interview that's coming? Lindsey Graham going to be coming in person? Does that come this week or next?
There are a couple of them coming, Chuck. So Lindsey Graham, yes, scheduled to testify next Tuesday here in the same place where Rudy Giuliani just left. Now, Lindsey Graham has said that he's going to fight that, but as of right now, he is scheduled to come on Tuesday. And then 2 days later, Jenna Ellis, the former advisor for former President Trump, rather the legal advisor for former President Trump, has also been ordered by a judge to come and appear. And that's something that we're both looking ahead to expect next week, Chuck.
And then also there's going to be a challenge. I saw the governor is challenging whether he has to appear before this special grand jury, Governor Brian Kemp. When does that get settled?
A motion that was just filed today, Chuck, a rather lengthy motion to quash that subpoena. It's interesting because in that it was revealed that what we expected to be a videotaped testimony by the governor never happened. That was revealed today for the very first time. He was subpoenaed thereafter, and now he's trying to quash that subpoena, Chuck.
All right, Blaine Alexander with a lot of developments just in one of arguably the four major legal investigations into some form of Donald Trump's actions. Blaine Alexander in Georgia for us. Blaine, thank you. Let me move over to you, David Priest, the editor-in-chief of Lawfare. I want to move to the Mar-a-Lago investigation. Sure. Specifically, this is obviously something your previous life you know a lot about. So a few things that we've learned. Number one, the fact that the Justice Department is fighting us in the media about releasing the affidavit, because there's been this theory, now that they got everything they need, maybe they'll not pursue. Mm-hmm. They're pursuing, right? I mean, isn't that what that tells us?
That's right. It also tells us we really don't know who are the main subjects of the investigation. It could be Trump. It could be people around Trump. Mm-hmm. Most likely, it seems it's probably both, Because remember, the Espionage Act doesn't just involve a person who has national defense information. It involves people who have knowledge of that. And that is an interesting thing when it comes to the attorneys like Philbin. Right. And now we have reporting that they've actually been talking to the FBI. Well, of course they have, because they have their job with their client.
Right.
They also may have some legal culpability, and they have to start weighing the ethics of what can I cooperate with the FBI about and what do I need to retain with my client.
Is that legal culpability have to do with the fact that both of them were designated representatives of the former president and having access to the archived material? Because they were early on, Pat Philbin and Pat Cipollone were designated as that. And then, bizarrely in June, which at some point we're going to find out, Donald Trump gave access to Kash Patel, an on-again, off-again intelligence aide of sorts to him, and then John Solomon, who used to be a journalist in some prominent news organizations, now runs some boutique internet sites. That raised some yellow flags, did it?
Yeah, we still really don't know. We don't know who knew what when in the process. Look, if I'm investigating this, which clearly I'm not, but if I'm investigating this, I want to know about the physical transfer during the transition. I have not worked in the National Archives. I've worked with archivists at 9 different presidential libraries, and they are meticulous about record keeping and about the movement of material. And they've gone through about 10 presidential transitions since the Presidential Records Act was signed.
Right.
You have people who are experienced with this kind of thing. They would have been throughout the transition and probably before talking to the president and his team about what are government documents and how are those supposed to be kept by the National Archives. And then after that, suddenly there are documents that aren't there. And then they go to Trump or his people and tell them that. And they return some documents, but not others. And they keep this discussion going. There were other people who knew about these documents. At what point were they advising the president about that? And at what point were they actually helping to not return the documents? That's an area for investigation.
We heard during a press conference, I think last week, from the House Republican Intelligence Committee, the Republicans on House Intel, and I believe one of them said, you know, if he had special access programs down there, that would be troubling.
Right.
Explain why, where even some, they held this press conference as a way to try to play down the situation, but then I think it was Congressman Stewart, I believe, is the one, I just don't want to get it wrong. He said, well, if special access programs, what makes that to you so alarming? Or
he really opened up an interesting door there.
Yeah.
So any classified material is classified for a reason. There is danger to national security if it's revealed, and that's whether it's confidential, secret, or top secret. But then there are compartmented programs. I had a top secret clearance. I had access to many compartmented programs, but not all of them, because I didn't need to know something about, for example, a sensitive collection method on North Korean nuclear weapons. There can be a very protected compartment, special access program, SAP. That material is so tightly held in the U.S. government, it is known who has ever seen it or become aware of it. That is the crown jewels, if you will, of intelligence.
Let me ask you this, though. Just basically, it's the honor system to classify what's in your head. He knows all of these. You know, he could very much regurgitate them, perhaps. Maybe he can recreate some of the documents himself. I understand how to protect actual documents. How do you protect that?
Yeah, it's the information in the documents that's classified,
yes.
right? The document is there, but you can communicate classified information through an oral briefing. You're still communicating classified information. So yes, anyone who has worked with classified information has a whole bunch of classified stuff up here.
But a former president, anything they blurt or say out is legal because they're the president at the time. Now, when they're former
president, they are
right.
president.
And when they're a former president, I mean, I guess the question is, I read somewhere where if Donald Trump could have basically declassified in his head, and as the documents were making their way to Mar-a-Lago, incoming President Biden could also reclassified the U-Haul truck on their way down.
Absolutely, and we've done some analysis on lawfare on this issue, and it points to the fact that there is uncertainty because these things have never reached a court of law. Right. But it is a fundamental truth that the president has classification and declassification authority over most, if not all, national defense information while president.
Right.
A former president has none. There's a very clear line at inauguration of your successor.
Right.
So if Trump is trying to say, well, I can declassify things, he's wrong. If he's trying to say, well, I did declassify them, I just didn't tell anybody or document it, then they're not declassified because that was not done while he was president.
Espionage Act got enough teeth for this to work, or is it a complicated law that is just a little fraught?
The Espionage Act is actually poorly named because it doesn't really deal solely with spying for the enemy. It has to do with the protection of national defense information and also the willing retention of that information when you know you shouldn't have it. That's the interesting angle here.
That's a subjective thing to try to prove. David Priest, editor-in-chief of Lawfare. Really interesting. Thanks very much.
You bet.
Up next, the CDC announces a major shakeup. Some might say, finally. You're watching Beat the Press now. Welcome back. Voters in Alaska this week cast their ballots in 4 statewide races, a special election that is using ranked choice voting for the first time, and 3 open primaries for the Senate, House, and gubernatorial races, where the top 4 candidates, regardless of party, will face off in a ranked choice voting election come November. So let's get started in the Senate race. The incumbent Senator Lisa Murkowski and Trump-backed ally Kelly Tshibaka will be among the candidates on the ballot in November as the former president looks to take down another Republican who supported impeachment. In this case, she voted to convict. Sarah Palin, the other Trump-backed candidate in Alaska, will also make it onto the ballot in November alongside 2 other Republicans and a Democrat for the state's lone House seat. But for the next few weeks, all eyes are going to be on Alaska's special election, where voters rank the candidates to determine who will serve out the remaining months of Congressman Don Young's term after he passed away earlier this year. And yes, Sarah Palin's also on that ballot as well. So while voters wait to see how the first round of ranked choice shakes out, Democrat Mary Peltola leads Sarah Palin, though neither candidate is remotely close to the 50% threshold. We're going to have to find out how that works and when that's going to happen. I'm joined now by Deb Otis, the director of research at Fair Vote. This is a nonprofit organization that advocates for election reforms, in particular, big advocates, I know Fair Vote is, with ranked choice voting, top 4 or 5 primaries. So I really appreciate having you here. Deb, let me start with this issue. And this came up with, I think it's Unite America, who's been running some of the campaigns to try to get these change in the primary systems on there. And that is the fact that we're going to be living in a black box for the next 8 to 10 days while Alaska waits for all of the ballots to come in before they start running the second choice and the third choice. And it seems that this is only going to lead, you already have Sarah Palin using this vacuum to critique the system. What should Alaska election officials do during this period?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. And I'll start by saying Alaska election officials are doing a lot of things right with this special election. This was a special election, so they're implementing ranked choice voting earlier than they expected to fill this vacancy in the House of Representatives. And by combining this with their already scheduled primary, they are boosting turnout. And for their first ranked choice voting election, they have done a good job being communicative about their schedule. They're not planning to run that ranked choice tabulation, get into those second choices until 15 days after the election. But they have been open and straightforward about that from the beginning. So we know what to expect, and we know exactly how long we'll be waiting during this counting period. Well,
look, I understand that they've communicated that, but again, we don't see it. And, look, we get preliminary election returns from secretaries of state all over the country every time an election is run. It seems, but all of a sudden they're withholding access. We don't know the second, third, fourth. It seems what's wrong with showing us a preliminary result of ranked choice voting based on the ballots that are left? Or ballots that are in their first,
in their first ranked choice election, they are being cautious with this counting period. We see ranked choice voting elections around the country where election results come out on election night or the day after. Once you're ready to run the RCV program, it's just a push of the button. It is sometimes called instant runoff because it is nearly that instant. Once you push the button, it happens in a matter of seconds to get those ranked choice results. And so this counting period is more about making sure to get all of the ballots in place. Alaska has a large rural population and plenty of military voters, so they have a generous window to allow those ballots to arrive.
But in best practices, if you could design what you think would be the most open and transparent at a time when you've got voters left and right who are questioning the integrity of our elections for different reasons and different motivations, but it's there. It seems to me that transparency should be the king here.
I think best practice would be to release those ranked choice results on election night, like we see in cities like San Francisco or Salt Lake City, for example. And I think this is something Alaska can possibly learn from for the future.
This year, one state is going to be deciding whether to go to this system. It's Nevada. I know that there was some thought that maybe Missouri, it would qualify this cycle. It did not. Realistically, how many states do you think top 4 or top 5 could get implemented in between now and, say, the end of this decade?
Well, I think that there's a lot to be gained from these systems in red states, blue states, purple states, no matter what. I will add that the top 4 or top 5 model of ranked choice voting is just one possible model. Other states like Maine are having success by keeping their partisan primaries in place and using ranked choice voting within party primaries in order to select their nominees. For example, Virginia Republicans just did this in 2 of their congressional districts. And so we're seeing success with both models. And it comes down to whether a state wants to keep that partisan primary model in place or not. Either way, ranked choice voting is the key to improving these elections.
I think more and more people that are studying this primary problem are coming to that conclusion. It seems to be the simplest way to get more people involved. We'll see if this momentum continues. Deb Otis from Fair Vote, thanks for coming on and explaining this process.
Thank you very much.
You got it. Still to come, a parentless pregnant teenager denied the right to an abortion. It's an emotional fight playing out right now in the Florida courts. We're going to go through that story ahead. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Just in the past hour, the South Carolina Supreme Court issued a temporary block on the state's 6-week abortion ban, granting an emergency motion by abortion providers for an injunction while the case is ongoing. Meanwhile, in Florida, a girl known in legal documents as simply 16-year-old Jane Doe 22B is pregnant, parentless, and in the care of Florida's child welfare system. She may now have no choice but to become a parent herself after an appeals court denied her access to an abortion, upholding a ruling earlier this week that she is not mature enough to make the decision to terminate her pregnancy. Florida is one of 36 states that require the consent of a parent or guardian for a minor to get an abortion. In 35 of those states, including Florida, teens can argue for a judicial waiver. Some of those use a minor's maturity, intelligence, and emotional stability as deciding factors in whether to grant a waiver. Believe it or not, GPA is sometimes used in some of these cases. Many of these parental consent laws have been in place for years, but they're back in the spotlight as just one of the many abortion restrictions that can take away the decision from patients and even doctors. And it puts all of these decisions in the hands of a court, raising the question of whether you can legislate every potential caveat or carve-out that you might need to be thinking about. Joined now by Dr. Rachel Rapkin. She's a Florida OB-GYN who does work for Planned Parenthood. Doctor, I appreciate you coming on. So let me start with this, because this law, we're living in a post-Roe world. This was a law that was already on the books. But here's my confusion about this specific case. I thought she had a guardian that was not the state of Florida, but the state of Florida is now acting as the guardian. Is that part of the confusion in this specific case? And I want to talk more generally, but that's a fact that I'm confused about here.
Yes, well, thanks for having me on. I'm happy to talk about this. I've not been involved in this individual's case specifically, so unfortunately I can't speak to all of the specific details in her case, but there's a lot of confusion about all of the laws surrounding abortion provision. I can tell you I talked to some of my staff today about adolescents and what care they're able to receive without obtaining parental consent. And there was so much confusion, even among healthcare workers, about what teens are and are not allowed to consent for by themselves.
And the law gets even trickier. If she were married, still at 16, and wanted this abortion, she would get it?
I honestly don't think so, unless she'd already had a child. And again, This is where it becomes really confusing. So adolescents, teens who are pregnant here in the state of Florida can consent to a variety of medical procedures. So they can consent to having an epidural during their pregnancy. They can consent to having a cesarean delivery if they need one, but they can't consent to having an abortion. And that really kind of others abortion procedures and further stigmatizes abortion and makes it seem like it's not part of healthcare when we all know that abortion is absolutely part of healthcare.
And let me ask you this though, would she, if she had a kid, but still being under 18 and wanted to get an abortion, would it still be this subjective judicial review?
Honestly, I think I'm not a lawyer. And this is absolutely one of those cases where I would consult my lawyer. If I were working at Planned Parenthood, if I were in a hospital, I would absolutely speak with risk management because it's so confusing. And I, as a physician who provides abortion services, and I'm not even the expert on that. And it becomes really confusing and further delays care. We have so many things, especially here in the state of Florida, between our 24-hour mandatory delay, the need for adolescents to obtain a parental consent or waiver or judicial bypass. All of these things further delay abortion care. And we already have a 15-week ban here. So we're finding ourselves in situations where teens have to jump through all of these hoops. And a lot of these teens are people who are already facing barriers to obtaining abortion services.
And the clock is ticking, literally, as you say, with the 15-week. Let me ask this: maturity. Talk about a subjective measurement. How does a court determine maturity? In our research, I discovered GPA was used, which just seems to be an odd thing to use, but I guess it's something. How have courts defined maturity?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. Nobody really knows. But we had a recent case here in Florida that was pretty well publicized, where a judge stated that because a teen had a low GPA, she had misspellings on her request for judicial bypass, she hadn't ever taken care of younger children, she had no financial responsibilities. These are all the things that came out that led to that judge's decision that she was not mature enough to have an abortion. Now, my question is, does that mean she's mature enough to continue a pregnancy and carry a pregnancy to term and possibly parent? That just doesn't make any sense.
Well, I was just going to say, if they determine she's not mature enough to have this abortion, are they taking her kid away when the kid's born?
Yeah, nobody knows. I mean, the Florida, the free state where a lot of our freedoms have clearly been taken away from us, unfortunately says that they care so much about babies, but when it comes down to it, we're not getting a whole lot of support. We have limited resources for those after they deliver, including childcare resources and other educational and basic needs resources. So we don't know. Florida does seem to take over a lot of care for being so free. Very quickly, you have the legal resources of Planned Parenthood, but the average OB-GYN these days, is this going to, what kind of legal bills are OB-GYNs going to feel like they're going to accumulate here to the point of, is it worth practicing in certain states? Yeah, that's definitely a concern that people, practicing physicians, are going to leave these states that have these heavily restrictive laws. Not only that, but those who stay feel really uncomfortable taking care of patients in many situations. We have exceptions to our 15-week ban here. Right. And one of those exceptions is threat to maternal life, but that's not well defined. And I can tell you, there are absolutely physicians here in Florida that are scared to provide life-saving abortion services because they're scared they're going to get arrested and lose their license. Dr. Rachel Rapkin, an OB-GYN, who does work for Planned Parenthood in Florida. Appreciate you coming on, sharing your perspective with us. And by the way, we've got a lot more on this Florida abortion case and Florida politics in general on the new episode of the Chuck Toddcast. Get it wherever you get your podcast. I'll see you back here tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. Hallie Jackson will see you right now with more NBC News Now.